Once, long ago, in the cold East, a girl was born in the month of the Revolution. She was called Mariia. Her complexion was bright and snowy as the winters in her forest, and her hair was as dark and rich as the soil the grain grew from. She was a smart girl, sharp, the daughter of a banker, though her lungs were prone to filling with water. She cured this ailment by swallowing embers lit by the flaming red sunlight. First, she fed her coals a little at a time, nursed on tiny shreds of tissue paper and burlap, but as she grew, so did the flames in her lungs. By the time she was 21 years old, she fed the fire in her chest with thick books and switches of oak. When she spoke, the fire leapt out of her throat and into the sky, to which the farmers told her, "You can't just stand there and talk all day. The Councillor Luzhanovsky will have your head." Not if I have his first. Depending on which historians you are talking to, the modern concept of terrorism was either invented by the Irish or the Russians. Regardless of origin, the broad concepts remain the same: violence to achieve political goals. The terrorists of the 1800s were undoubtedly inspired by Romanticism in many ways, and took an equally large inspiration from the nihilist movement. This kind of violence was seen by many not as an uncivilized act committed by cowards, but as the final revolt of the individual. In the age of nationalism, liberalism, and revolution, many an oppressive regime turned to force and reaction to quash dissent and reform, and for many, the easiest way to have one's voice heard and to achieve direct systemic change was by going for the throat. They saw themselves as tragic heroes, fit to be the protagonist of any number of Russian literary works. They don't kill out of some psychotic desire to hurt others, but as a method of making statements, of punishing those deemed guilty and saving those who toiled under the tyranny of the despotic tsardom. The knife, bomb, and bullet became tools of protest and tools of achieving immediate change, not only to directly remove those they saw as enemies of the people, but also to create scandal and inspire the people to popular revolution by showing them that the regimes they often hated were not invincible. And if one man or woman could shake the world, then surely a million could shatter it completely. This romantic, idealistic revolutionary thought contrasted with actual popular opinion, which was usually only on their side if they were targeting someone the people despised utterly. To many, they were insane. Their attacks were functionally pointless, targeting easily replaceable suits while doing very little actual damage to the institutions of the state, and their attacks usually brought increased repressions upon local populations. The very people they claimed to be fighting for very often saw them as delusional, idealistic, and as threats to their way of life. While several Russian groups made usage of terrorism, they could mostly trace their origins to the Narodniks. This was a movement amongst the Russian intelligentsia that saw the peasantry of Russia as a revolutionary class, and due to the nature of Russian economic development, the peasants were the class that would bring about transition to socialism. They supported education, land socialization, and the abolition of the monarchy to be replaced with a socialist democracy. The problem the Narodniks had was that, while they claimed to represent the peasants, they were dominated by urban, educated individuals. Their attempts to reach the peasantry through debate and education campaigns to stir them up usually failed because the peasants simply didn't care, and were inherently distrustful of the slick urbanites who knew nothing of the true struggles of their class. The peasants were also generally very religious, and while they hated many of the officials and landowners that directly subjugated them, they didn't hate the Tsar, and in fact were very supportive of the monarchy and didn't take kindly to these calls to abolish it. More often than not, the first people to report the Narodnik agitators to the Okhrana were the peasants. This wasn't helped by the Tsarist government constantly cracking down on them, leading to a dramatic increase in radicalization amongst the disgruntled Narodniks. As a consequence, many took to direct action as a way of bringing their revolution about, with one organization, called People's Will, even assassinating Tsar Alexander II himself in 1881. This caused the movement to be repressed further, and Narodism would lose the support it did have due to the recent emancipation of the peasants carried out by the Tsar, which made him very popular. The Russian left would then split, with the Narodniks being usurped. The Marxists would disavow terrorism for the most part, forming Emancipation of Labor in 1883, and several other organizations which would eventually unite to form the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The anarchist tendency would split off in the other direction, some parts of which eventually also adopting terrorist tactics, which included expropriations at gunpoint. What remained of the Narodnik faithful would eventually rebound in the 1890s, and this time they would have more success, still maintaining political terrorism as a tenet of their organizations. In the middle of everything remained the Russian peasantry. They were the vast majority of the population, and yet existed largely at the whim of the landowning class, even after the abolition of serfdom. The peasant toiling the fertile black soils of the western steppes contrasted with the burgeoning industrial worker, as cities across the empire became dominated by factories and townhouses. Neither the workers or peasants were happy. Unrest was growing exponentially by the ascension of Tsar Nicholas II in 1894, and many would look at the fat cats in their estates and the sadistic tools of the state that existed to crush dissent, and they would feel enraged. And the romantic terrorist was born anew, sacking the estates and executing the sadists, with political violence exploding in the 1890s. One region of many defined by the suppressed and agitating peasantry and the growing urban proletariat was that of Tambov, and Tambov is where our story begins. In the sleepy city of Tambov proper, on October the 16th or 28th of 1884, Maria Alexandrovna Spiridonova was born. Far from the nation-rocking Scarlet Valkyrie that she would come to be known as, her early life was simple and comfortable. Peasant-born she most certainly was not. Her father, Alexander Spiridonov, was minor non-hereditary nobility in the city, having earned his keep as a tradesman and later as either a bank official or a collegiate secretary, depending on where you look, which made him nobility by virtue of government service. Not much is seemingly known about her mother, nor is much known about her early life in general. Many of her formative years were simply never put to paper. It can be inferred that the family was reasonably well off due to her dad's position, and as such, her early years were more than likely comparatively normal. Not born into obscene wealth, but not towing the poverty line either. What is known, however, is that she was a tempestuous girl from the get-go. She is described as a chaotic, fiery, and fun person. She was a prolific reader, becoming incredibly well-versed in Russian literature, an art form experiencing a golden age of its own, while developing a particular taste for the Romanticist stream. She took every possible opportunity to utilize her literacy to the fullest, and as such, she very likely dabbled in the creative arts in some form, most likely writing due to the quality of her later written works, but that is pure conjecture on my part. The lack of concrete information about her youth also means that nobody quite knows how exactly she made her way onto the path of socialism. But if I had to take a guess, a big part of it was likely the sheer breadth of the human experience that she had. She was growing up in a time of immense social strife in Russia. The recently emancipated peasants were chafing under their continued subjugation and lack of opportunity. The slow industrialization of the country was radically transforming urban society. Russian literature and culture were flourishing, pushing the bounds of cultural normativity and ushering in a cultural awakening that sought to truly define what it meant to be Russian, and social movements on the left and right were sweeping the nation. Spiridonova, being minor nobility in a rapidly growing city like Tambov, had a front row seat to the complete uprooting and redefining of society. It's honestly no wonder that the romantic and the adventurer found herself drawn to revolutionary ideas and the plights of the workers and peasants. In the mid-1890s, she began attending the local Tambov Girls' Gymnasium. She performed well, showing herself to be very intelligent and academically inclined. Her rebellious spirit followed her, and she developed extremely strong moral convictions. She came to reject the comfort of her upbringing in favor of living a rather modest existence, especially when it came to how she presented herself to others. By the end of her time at the gymnasium, she had radicalized herself into a socialist, and she sought to live her life in accordance with the ideals she preached. She was a popular and well-respected figure amongst her peers as a result, and this idealism would carry her for the rest of her life. In 1902, at the age of 18, she would conclude her studies at the gymnasium, which was preceded by both the death of her father and a sudden bout of tuberculosis. She nearly dies from this, and it left her with permanent health issues that would be a recurring problem throughout her life. After all this, she would begin attending university in Moscow, studying, of all things, dentistry. In her off time, she found work as a clerk for the local assembly of the nobility, which gave her a lot of practical experience in matters of administration. This ended, however, with the arrival of the chaos of 1905. Spiridonova, being a woman of conviction, was a permanent presence amongst the student movements of the late Russian Empire. The Russian university population was very small, but they were very, very loud. The students had radicalized dramatically since the 1890s, and by the time of the 1905 revolution, they had become such a permanent thorn in the side of the imperial government that they shut literally all of them down to try and keep them contained. This did absolutely nothing to stop them, and the students instead joined the ranks of the literal millions of striking workers that had begun tearing the country apart in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday in January of 1905. The government responded to these protests initially by doing the only thing it knew how: violent crackdowns, and thousands of strikers and protesters would be massacred in the early months of 1905. Spiridonova was lucky enough to not get, shot down like a dog in the street, but she would be rather violently arrested in March of 1905, being beaten for good measure. Her imprisonment lasted only about a month, as the government started mass amnestying certain subsets of political prisoners in an attempt to salvage the situation, after which she went back to causing mischief and joining in marches. With the Tsar caving on many demands as 1905 progressed, progressed, culminating with the publication of the October Manifesto, which transformed the empire into a constitutional monarchy, many of the protesters, Spiridonova included, laid off as a show of good faith. For now. Determining that good work had been done, in September, Spiridonova found herself faced with the ultimate dilemma that I have highlighted in several videos now. She tried to receive training as an assistant physician, from which she was rejected because she had, a record of arrest for political activities. She couldn't take up a trade, and she couldn't join the army by virtue of being a woman in Russia, so she elected to pick the third option. Become a socialist terrorist. At the tail end of 1905, she signed up with a familiar face. The Party of Socialists-Revolutionaries. She found other flame breathers who helped her collect oak bark and books. They helped dress her in a black shirt with a high collar and black trousers and tucked her fine black hair under a jaunty cap. They showed her where to wait by the train station, how to listen for the rumble of his car coming down the road. She needed not help for her fire breathing. She caught sight of his round belly and thinning hair and opened her mouth wide. Furious red flame flew up her windpipe, out her esophagus, out of her screaming throat. But the Councillor Luzhanovsky was strong because of all the rich viands and dark red wine he drank. Though his skin was blistered as a roast pig, he did not die immediately. That took a few days. The SRs officially popped into being in 1902 as a merger of half a dozen socialist organizations that had roots in the Narodnik movement. The party itself was somewhat divided between pro-worker and pro-peasant camps, but the fact that they now paid attention to both meant that they grew rapidly in popular support. PSR doctrine, pushed by its main leader and thinker, Viktor Chernov, held that the proletariat were the vanguard of the revolution, while the peasantry were the army, seeing both of them as different parts of the same working class. Their advances to the peasantry in particular were much better received now that the movement could present a coherent platform and provide a legitimate alternative, and the massive increase in radicalization amongst both the peasantry and workers meant that PSR actually became a major political force in the run-up to the 1905 revolution. Of course, the Tsarists did not like them, and the party was under constant threat from the get-go. Much of their leadership was out of the country, and those who remained in Russia went in and out of the prison system like a revolving door. The cult of revolutionary violence was a defining feature of the SRs, a holdover from their Narodnik roots. Between 1902 and 1914, PSR and people affiliated with the party killed hundreds of people of varying standing, and there was a great deal of romanticism surrounding the terrorist idea within the party, including at its highest echelons of leadership. The intention was to spark the revolutionary spirit within the working and peasant classes by showing them that the regime wasn't invincible, theoretically pushing them towards popular revolt. They went as far as to professionalize terror through the establishment of the Combat Organization, which was their hit squad dedicated to targeting officials at the highest levels that required more secrecy and discipline than simple street-level murders. The Combat Org was responsible for several high-profile kills, including 2 interior ministers, 2 provincial governors, a member of the Romanov family, and Father Gapon, the priest that led the 1905 St. Petersburg March that devolved into Bloody Sunday. He turned out to be a police informant, and when he revealed this to a member of the Combat Org, he was left in a room with 3 SR members and died. Nobody quite knows how. Revolutionary violence became a massive draw for many people, including Maria Spiridonova, the fiery young romantic who yearned to do something about the day-to-day oppression she found herself surrounded by in the Tambov region, was entranced by the prospect of being able to directly create change, and to make things better for people. Women were notably at the forefront of revolutionary activities in Russia. They were treated horrifically by broader Russian society, and were essentially second-class citizens with no personal autonomy or rights. And as such, many women that were capable of existing beyond what the state and the men of society declared, threw their lots in with revolutionary movements hoping to achieve some kind of change. Estimates place the number of revolutionary women in Russia in 1917 as over 18,000 across the political left, and those are just the ones with stated organizational affiliations. Even as far back as the Narodniks and People's Will, women played major roles, especially in the field of direct action. Russian women elected to skip the peaceful protest stage and jump straight to shooting officials, bombing police stations, and sacking noble estates, earning fame and infamy as revolutionary Valkyries. And they paid the price for it, hanging for their actions, and literal thousands being arrested for revolutionary activity between 1860 and 1917. Russian women understood the need to fight for their rights, and Spiridonova, through her association with PSR, would be joining the illustrious ranks of those who refused to be silenced. She initially found her way into the party through a fella named Vladimir Volsky. He was a fellow Tambov native and an intelligent and well-spoken man. Details are sparse, as Spiridonova kept the details of her private life, well, private, but at some point in 1905, the two met and ended up having a crazy fling. Volsky was a married man, but he and Spiridonova, by 1906, were referring to each other as fiancés in a few instances. She ideologically aligned with them on most things, so it was largely inevitable after enough time, but he was more than likely her way into the party, at least in an immediate practical sense. This love affair is implied to be rather short, as the two were separated by arrest, but it is still important to mention. Now that she was officially a part of those who were striving for dramatic change, she turned to playing her role. For the workers and peasants of Tambov, she was to become the tragic hero. In December of 1905, the Tambov province was placed under martial law. Peasant unrest in the region had gotten really bad, with the peasants interpreting the October Manifesto as a go-ahead to start killing landowners, stealing their stuff, and redistributing their property. Tambov's governor, a fellow named Vladimir Fedorovich von der Launitz, appointed one Gavril Nikolaevich Luzhanovsky, a lawyer who was on the provincial council, to the position of security chief, or essentially the chief of police, of the town of Borisogledsk. Luzhanovsky was a terrible person, and he was reviled by the local peasants. He was a black hundredist. The best comparison I can think of is that it was the Russian equivalent of the KKK, and was the leader of the local branch. He ran the security apparatus with an iron fist, doing his best to crush any sense of independence amongst the peasantry. He had a tendency to use horrific torture to enforce compliance, eventually resorting to sending an army regiment out into the countryside to just start shooting people. For this, he found himself targeted by the Tambov Committee of the SRs, who very publicly condemned him to death through their propaganda efforts, and Spiridonova, being from Tambov herself, seemed the perfect candidate for the hit. Unlike Savinkov, who brought an entire team of semi-professional hitmen to blow up his targets with explosives, Spiridonova elected to lone wolf it, just her and a revolver tucked away inside her dress. Adopting the guise of a high school student from the town, she stalked Luzhanovsky for over a week, learning his movements and fishing for openings. Finally, on the afternoon of January 16th of 1906, she caught him at a moment where he was vulnerable at the railway station. She snuck onto the train carriage he was in, and as he was getting off, in the brief moments before he was swarmed by Cossacks and police for his protection, she acted. In a single moment, she would write her name into history in blood. She rushes towards him, quickly draws her revolver, and literally fans the hammer at this guy, hitting him dead on with 5 shots. 2 in the stomach, 2 in the chest, and 1 in his upper arm. He, surprisingly, did not die on the spot, as people who are, shot 5 times. Instead, he was rushed to a hospital, where he limped on in unimaginable agony for 25 days, before eventually succumbing to his wounds on February 10th. Meanwhile, Mariia screamed and spat fire, but was no match for the councilor's burly guards. They seized her by her arms and legs and clapped their leather hands over her mouth as they hauled her to their dungeon. They tore off her black shirt with a high collar and black trousers and ripped her jaunty cap off her head. Then they whipped her with oak switches and kicked her with their heavy boots. They leered and whistled as she wept alone in the darkness and silence of her cell. The silence was broken with a gentle tapping on metal. She looked up, and a small gray pigeon looked down at her through the barred window. "My name is Yulia," the pigeon cooed, "and I have watched those beasts tear your black shirt with a high collar and your black trousers from your body, rip your jaunty cap from your head, whip you with oak switches, and kick you with their heavy boots. I listened to them whistle and call as you wept alone in the silence. I want to help you, Mariia, although I am only small and have no strength." Mariia smiled at the pigeon, even though the bruises on her face made it difficult. Spiridonova, having succeeded in her objective, now faced the problem of having shot a major political figure dead in broad daylight, surrounded by people. She attempted to shoot herself to avoid capture, but the Cossacks got to her first, smashing her head in with the butts of rifles and beating her savagely on the train platform. After banging her head into the pavement a few times, she was dragged by the braid of her hair into a nearby police vehicle and taken to the local constabulary. Much of what I am about to tell you was recounted by Spiridonova herself in a letter dictated soon after her imprisonment that she was able to smuggle to the press, and the things she describes are truly horrifying. Upon her arrival at the station, she was stripped completely naked and tossed in an unheated cell with a stone floor. A few hours later, a Cossack officer, a brute referred to as P.F. Avramov, and a police officer, T.S. Zhdanov, entered the cell and began a nearly 7-hour interrogation. She was beaten and whipped savagely while her 2 captors taunted her. They pulled out strands of her hair, crushed her feet with their boots, singed her body with lit cigarettes, and threatened to have the rest of of the Cossack guards gang rape her. All the while, they demanded for her to scream. Scream she did not, and this made her captors angrier, and the torture became more brutal as a consequence. She was forbidden from eating or drinking water and had grown quite delirious by the end of her interrogation. She was then piled onto a train with Avramov and his Cossacks and taken to Tambov for further questioning. During the train ride, Spiridonova was sexually harassed by Avramov multiple times, a fact that was confirmed by others in the car during an official investigation, and in her letter she leaves open the possibility that she was raped. By the time she arrived in Tambov, she was starving, dehydrated, shivering with pain with one of her eyes swollen shut, and sick with a bout of untreated tuberculosis. However, none of this succeeded in breaking her spirit. She did not scream, and she gave no one else up. When she was then required to provide a statement to the court authorities, she showed no remorse, simply stating that the Tambov SRs had passed judgment on Luzhanovsky for his crimes against the peasantry, and that she was simply carrying out the will of the people of Russia. She ended the letter by saying, "If they kill me, I will die at peace with myself." While awaiting trial, she composed this letter, detailing everything about the assassination and her internment in succinct and well-structured detail. The letter also has a very noticeable literary flair, and its tone and structure were reminiscent of many a classic novel. 2 days after Luzhanovsky's death, she was able to smuggle this letter out of prison and leak it to the press through her sister Yulia, which prompted an absolute storm of controversy. When the liberal press got a hold of the story, they ran with it, decrying her treatment as monstrous and barbaric, demanding Avramov and Zhdanov be put on trial themselves, and painting Spiridonova as a young and virginal woman who was abused by those in positions of authority. Conservative presses, meanwhile, immediately called it a made-up story written by a terrorist attempting to garner sympathy. This situation, more so than any other assassination, started a legitimate cultural conversation in the empire, not only about the tendency of society to lionize terrorists, but also about the treatment of women by the regime in general. It also serves as an interesting look at how the media has literally not changed at all since its inception. The media overwhelmingly focused on the fact that she was a woman of noble background. Reports and articles all focused on her appearance, painting her as a small, delicate-seeming girl-next-door type. They also really focused on the implied rape part. In her letter, she never directly claims to have been sexually assaulted, but the liberal press elected to fill in the perceived gaps in her story for her, portraying Spiridonova as a pure and chaste woman of class who had that torn away from her by the barbaric Cossacks. Of course, it is known that she had a romantic relationship with Volsky, a legally married man, but that was conveniently left out of the reports. The liberal presses hammed things up to the point that Spiridonova herself had to repudiate one of their reporters after he conveniently ignored that she was a socialist because it didn't fit the narrative they were going with, and just started making things up about her medical condition, like claiming she had contracted syphilis, which was just not true. But once the public had a hold on the story, there was no putting the fire out. Spiridonova's act of terrorism had accomplished its goal. It had caused chaos and controversy. Now she simply waited for the inevitable death sentence. The courts pretty quickly realized that if they executed this girl, there would be violence. On March 11th, her sentence was handed down as death by hanging, but they recommended the Moscow military district to commute the sentence to hard labor in Siberia. The official reason was her tuberculosis, which had worsened dramatically, and as such, this commutation was accepted on the 20th. This is where her relationship with Volsky became known to authorities, including to the governor of Tambov, but he elected to keep the details of it to himself in order to protect the names of those two well-respected local families. This was fine for Spiridonova, who really wanted her romantic life to remain quiet. However, this had the other effect of Spiridonova's request to meet with Volsky, who was also in prison, being denied. Despite that, she would live on, even if interned. The same could not be said for her captors. On April 2nd, Avramov was shot dead in the street. His killer was never caught. Zhdanov followed a month later. Now, even the conservative papers were yelling at the government for allowing things to get this out of hand, forcing a rare moment of transparency and seeing them release an official report on the case to the public. The official government investigation into her treatment repudiated specifically the idea that she was raped, as well as the more brutal physical torture she claimed to have experienced. This raises an interesting point. In the letters to Yulia, Spiridonova pretty much comes out and says that the point of everything was to create a massive scandal. Luzhanovsky was an evil man, sure, but ultimately he was an irrelevant low-level official in a minor imperial province. Spiridonova was able to turn his death into a national scandal that accelerated the long-term progress of the revolution. Her treatment was absolutely appalling, but she endured it because she saw it as a sacrifice. By making some slight embellishments to the story and simply implying that she may have been sexually assaulted, it was enough to cause this minor assassination, one of dozens that occurred in 1906 alone, to become a pivotal moment in the chronology of the Russian Revolution. Furthermore, this public outrage she had directly created challenged government notions about the nature of revolutionaries. Here was a soft-spoken, young, and conventionally attractive Russian woman of solid societal standing taking action against the tyranny of the Tsardom, not some German agent provocateur or a regional nationalist. The general public, and especially the liberals, saw her as a tragic hero that represented all of the faults of the imperial system. The system propped up evil men and made them immune to legal punishment, so good people needed to resort to violence in order for justice to be achieved. She had martyred herself against the hated imperial regime, and she didn't even have to die to do it. Spiridonova was nothing short of brilliant in her handling of the whole situation, and did more for the revolution with 5 bullets and a pen than many in PSR would do in their entire careers. You can be the most help of all, little bird, for such reasons. Fly back to the village and report what you have seen to the other birds, that you have seen them tear my black shirt with a high collar and my black trousers from my body, rip my jaunty cap from my head, whip me with oak switches, and kick me with heavy boots. Then tell them that they must fly back to their villages and report what you have told them to the birds they know. The pigeon nodded, and off she went. Soon the dungeon was engulfed with a chorus of birdsong, followed shortly by hollers and heckles. The villagers had overheard what the birds were saying and had swarmed to collect Mariia. The foolish guards realized they had no choice and threw her on a train and slammed the door behind her. The train carried her to the coldest part of the furthest east, where all she could see was white snow in all 4 directions. There she stayed in a shack made of ash for 10 long years. The train ride to the Far East was met with fanfare. She was shoved into train cars with 5 other notable female SR terrorists. They were Rebecca Moiseyevna Fialka, Lydia Ezerskaya, Anastasia Alexievna Bitsenko, Maria Shkolnik, and Alexandra Adolfovna Izmailovich. They collectively came to be known as the Shesterka, literally the 6, and their month-long ride to Siberia saw them met with enraptured crowds at literally every stop they made. Spiridonova did her best to smile for the cameras, answer questions, and push the SR party program wherever they stopped, but in reality she was struggling. Her tuberculosis just wasn't going away. She was coughing up blood and had a near-permanent fever in between long bouts of unconsciousness. After over a month of travel down the Trans-Siberian, the Shesterka arrived at the Nerchinsk Katorga, which was a massive labor camp network. She and her comrades were shuffled between subcamps every couple of years, some dedicated exclusively to women and others gender-neutral, but the grouping remained the same, so they got to know each other very well. In general, conditions for the women were significantly less harsh than they were for other political prisoners. Instead of being tortured, the women were more so broken down through isolation. Their forced labor didn't actually start until 1911, and many of them were actually stoked, because the last 5 years had been mind-crushingly boring. But for Spiridonova, even the forced labor did not bring respite. The time from 1906 to 1917 was terrible the whole way through. Her illness seemed to be taunting her. It came in waves of excruciating pain, coughing up pieces of her insides and running long fevers, her crippled state further exacerbated by the weather of the Far East, shifting between dry, freezing winters and humid summers. She would spend days delirious and unconscious, and nothing seemed to actually fix it. It was so bad that she had her own building where her living quarters were, as she was often incapable of living in a shared space. And yet, it never let her die. She would recover for a while before slipping back on a whim, with the camp doctors not trying particularly hard since she was an enemy of the state. The exception was one, a man of liberal leaning who was sympathetic to the prisoners, who did his best to make sure Spiridonova and the other prisoners didn't croak. But for 11 long years, Spiridonova was martyred by illness. In between bouts, however, she still tried to function semi-normally. Tradition in the Siberian camps amongst the leftist prisoners was to establish commune systems, where the prisoners would unite in solidarity, pooling what little resources they had and dividing up their labor to make sure things went relatively smoothly. The women, especially Izmailovich, did a lot of the practical heavy lifting, holding classes and study sessions, teaching the children of political exiles, and even tending to gardens constructed in the prison complex. Spiridonova tried her best to participate in this communalism, but her efforts were limited by her continued invalidity and isolation from much of the group. When she was conscious and functional, she also tried to make some friends with her fellow inmates, which was fairly successful. She would develop particularly close friendships with Alexander Izmailovich, and later with a woman named Irina Kakovskaya, who arrived at the camps in 1908. These 2 women would be close confidants of Spiridonova for much of the rest of her life. If anything, Spiridonova's refusal to give in and die put on display her endurance. She was an exceptionally stalwart and disciplined woman, and despite everything the Tsar and his lackeys had thrown at her, she did not yield. If anything, her time in prison hardened her further and made her even more certain of her beliefs. Her contemporaries almost universally described her as a brilliant and strong woman, with overwhelming conviction in her beliefs and the willpower and knowledge to back them up. She was a skilled writer and speaker and had a way of communicating that was very dramatized but still incredibly classy. She was also very intelligent more generally and was adept at quickly wrapping her head around complex ideas. She was a very kind and cheerful woman to her friends and allies and was well liked by most people she met, which bought her trust and loyalty from a great many people. On this note, one constant of her life was her remarkable ability to charm people, and she had a history of befriending prison guards and secret police agents to make her times in captivity significantly easier. She was also an unflinching idealist, and sincerely believed in both the fundamental good of people and socialism's potential to create a free and fair society, which gave her a reputation as a positive force within revolutionary circles. That said, she never let kindness be mistaken for weakness. She had a will of iron and an incredibly commanding presence despite her small stature, and even while ill, she could hold the attention of a room with her words. And, of course, she was more than willing to shoot first, so to speak, as we have seen. There was a persistent fire and willingness to self-sacrifice behind everything she said or did, and as such, she became a valuable member of the revolutionary cause. Her first stint in prison simply served to stoke the flame and build her into somebody who, if the conditions were right, could potentially achieve great change. Finally, while she missed so incredibly much while in prison, the people outside of the walls of her cell certainly did not forget about her. In her absence, PSR worked to exploit her image and further expand it. Spiridonova became mythologized, the perfect revolutionary, a representative of the common men and women who fought for the rights of the peasants even at the cost of her own freedom. She became idolized and lionized by both the party and the peasants of the country, and the imagery surrounding her assassination of Luzhanovsky was used to translate that into popular support for the party. Through the First World War, PSR skyrocketed in renown, and with it went Spiridonova. As such, when the Tsardom was finally toppled in February of 1917 and a general amnesty of political prisoners was declared, she was one of the first people to have their door kicked open. Soon Mariia was freed by the new leader, Chairman Lenin, and took the train back to the forests and fields from which she came. As her train arrived, she was met by the overjoyed villagers, for whom she released a weak but celebratory blast of flame. But Mariia was not contented with village life, so she quickly made her way to Moscow to become a member of Chairman Lenin's council. There, she breathed her angry red flame for square men in brown suits with scrubby mustaches. It wasn't long before they tired of her fire-breathing ways. In the lead-up to World War I, PSR was on the verge of splitting in two along doctrinal lines. This was triggered by a schism over the usage of terrorism in the aftermath of the Azov affair, but it ballooned into general disagreements over basic party policy. Severe crackdowns by the Okhrana, destroying basically their entire Russian apparatus, and the agrarian Stolypin reforms threatening their largest support base did not help matters. This schism only worsened with the outbreak of World War I, as socialist movements across Europe suddenly found themselves with a decision to make. Do you support the war in the name of national solidarity, hoping that you can leverage it to push a reformist agenda, or do you oppose it as yet another senseless imperialistic bloodletting, hoping it will eventually lead to a broad revolution as the working classes and soldiers realize how pointless it all is? PSR split almost perfectly down the middle. A large faction, comprised mainly of those still in Russia, elected to support Russia's war effort, while most of those still in exile did not. The death of socialism in this case was nationalism. PSR had to ask itself, are we Russians first, or are we socialists first? And like many leftists across Europe, the answer was that they were Russians. Chernov himself was notably in the anti-war crowd, and he even attended the Zimmerwald conference, but that faction of PSR became an increasing minority voice in the party. The pro-war stance did pay dividends, as it meant that not only were the Tsarists a lot more chill with their existence, but it also allowed them to pick up big support by showing themselves to be patriotic, but still demanding of reforms that benefited the people. That said, apart from propagandizing and the few deputies they had in the Duma, PSR was still pretty heavily suppressed, so they were not front and center of the political agitation in the way the cadets were. After the February Revolution, however, this would change. PSR deputies in the Duma had a hand in establishing the Petrograd Soviet, and suddenly took a commanding role in Russian politics as a counterweight to the liberal-dominated provisional government. Then, after the April crisis and the collapse of the Milyukov government, PSR found themselves a part of the governing coalition as the liberals tried to salvage their popularity. Of course, this was not all that in a bag of chips. ships. PSR formally continued the policy of supporting the war effort, which was the very thing that caused Milyukov's government to collapse, which deepened the divide in the ranks. By the spring of 1917, this had crystallized into the Right SRs, an increasingly moderate faction led by Chernov and many of the older members of the party that supported the provisional government. Side note, Chernov flip-flops a bunch of times in his beliefs, just so you know. And the Left SRs, the faction led by Boris Kamkov and the young guard of the party that was angry at the propping up of the faltering bourgeois government and the continued betrayal of their increasingly radical support base amongst the workers and peasants. Anti-war sentiment was skyrocketing and living conditions were dropping precipitously, and the Right SRs were increasingly seen as traitors to the people, backing the provisional government to hold on to personal power. This schism was deepening rapidly as the intelligentsia supported the right as a moderate and reformist social movement while the workers and soldiers flocked to the left in droves. By the time Maria Spiridonova arrived in Moscow for the Third SR Party Congress in May of 1917, this split was threatening to tear the party apart. Her train ride back across Siberia was more therapeutic than 11 years of attention by doctors, and by the time she got to Moscow, the revolutionary fire in her had returned, and it was hotter than ever. Her 11 years in hell had, at least, done nothing to impact her broad popularity. Before she had even arrived in Moscow, she was elected to the executive committee of the First All-Russian Congress of Peasants' Deputies by, of all things, a unit of the Russian army, a role which was essentially ceremonial because she was not actually there to attend the Congress until the very end. In May, she would attend the aforementioned SR Party Congress, where she finally linked up with her people and was able to reinsert herself into the political scene. Her beliefs had hardened during her time on the inside, and she was almost immediately disgusted by Chernov and the right's attempts to cuddle up with the provisional government, and as such, she quickly threw her lot in with the left faction. She spent a lot of time poking the party with a stick, trying to get them to actually live up to the revolutionary part of their name. She didn't end up being elected to the party central committee due to the right still being dominant and her not really having any political experience, but her fiery personality and her impressive and impassioned oratorical skills meant that she became one of the leading figures of the left SRs. She was seemingly vindicated after the failure of the Kerensky offensive, which destroyed what war support remained in the nation and led to the collapse of the coalition government. She arrived in Petrograd in time for the July days and attempted seizure of power by workers and soldiers in the capital in the name of the Soviet. The right SR and Menshevik members of the Soviets were clashing with the Bolsheviks and left SRs over the uprising and the conduct of the new government, with the rightist factions essentially attempting a soft coup by threatening to kick out anyone who didn't agree with the opinion of the majority. At one point, however, the little fire breather made her way to the podium and gave a brief but passionate speech denouncing the rightists as attempting to suspend the will of the people. Alas, her speech was not received well. She was met with a chorus of shouts, being denounced as a hysteric. The revolutionary parties of the Petrograd Soviet simply would not hear it from the mouth of a woman, and even more so, did not want to hear any criticism of their own policies. The rightists still held a majority in the Soviet and would vote to confirm the reshuffling and continuation of the provisional government, putting Kerensky in the captain's chair and sliding it further to the left, but ultimately prolonging the existence of what was seen by an increasingly large number of people as a failing experiment. This only served to push her further to the left. After the failure of the Kornilov Putsch in September of 1917, Spiridonova gave a speech at the All-Russian Democratic Conference, called by the various Soviet leaders to have a debate on the future of the government. She was noted to be the only speaker to show any backbone, giving an impassioned and scathing denouncement of the provisional government and the liberal socialist coalition as a betrayal of the working classes. In a moment of supreme historical irony, the very same liberal papers that championed her as a tragic victim of the Tsarist system in 1906 now called her out as a hysterical radical. However, this time, the speech was received much better. Popular consciousness was rapidly swinging towards the far left. The Bolsheviks were now a few votes shy of a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, and basically all of the growth PSR was experiencing was to the benefit of the left faction. As such, despite the rightist factions also denouncing the Bolsheviks, Spiridonova's increasing calls for an end to dual power were met with broader support. This was happening alongside her calls for a broad socialist coalition that included the Bolsheviks in order to prevent what she saw as an inevitable civil war. This policy would become standard among the left SRs and served to further widen the gulf between the two wings of the party. And, of course, she did her absolute best to meet with every single peasant who made the journey to attend the conference, many still deeply enamored by the revolutionary myth that had coalesced around her. Of course, she did still receive blistering criticism from all directions. The Russian liberals now decried her as a radical, a crazy person, and a whore now that she didn't fit with the narratives they continued to spin. She had an unconfirmed and potentially fabricated romantic relationship with a PSR member named Peter Dekonski during the summer of 1917, which was subject to vicious rumors after it was revealed that Dekonski was a former Ochrana agent. She had organized his release after he was arrested on the charge of being a provocateur, and she was jeered by her opponents for her presumed romantic relationship with him that it has never been confirmed she actually had. Any perceived imperfection in Spiridonova's character was used to paint her as a delusional and hysterical woman, fabricated ideas that would be used against her time and time again. In fact, women on all sides of the Russian Revolution were treated similarly. The Bolshevik firebrand Kollontai was subject to similar criticism over her relationship with her second husband Pavel Dybenko, which was used to denounce her own powerful oratorical capabilities as simply women's hysteria. There is a much larger argument to be made about the treatment of women in the Russian Revolution and its aftermath that is unfortunately beyond the scope of this video, but if you want a solid look, I highly recommend Motherland, A Feminist History of Modern Russia by Julia Yoff. The idea that Spiridonova was somehow mentally unwell would become the most common criticism levied against her, despite having no real basis in reality. Of course, in the name of party discipline, members of PSR always came to her defense, both in writing and speaking, but it is clear that they never quite squared her existence as a leading figure in their movement. And after the rise of the Bolsheviks and the eventual fall of PSR from popular power, many exiled former members of the party would retroactively criticize her quite severely. No matter what anyone thought of her, Spiridonova's actions were contributing to the rapid growth of PSR in the closing months of 1917. As previously stated, a significant amount of this growth was directed towards the left faction, allowing them to take control of the St. Petersburg branch of the party in September. This coincided with an explosion of growth for the Bolshevik factions of the regional Soviets, which only pushed PSR further towards a split as the right faction continued to prop up the bourgeois democratic government. In their hubris, the right did not realize that its support amongst the soldiers was being dramatically eroded and that their chances to prevent a radical takeover were slipping away rapidly. The rank and file of the party had become increasingly radical in their hatred of the war, and PSR's attempts at keeping the war going meant that the leadership was increasingly out of touch with its support base. The intelligentsia that made up the right increasingly fell into the trappings of the old Narodniks, failing to properly assess the opinions and beliefs of the peasantry. By the fall, peasant revolts were breaking out across the country, and the old leadership of the right SRs simply refused to read the room. As such, the young guard of the party flocked to the left, leaving the right confident in a support base that no longer existed. Spiridonova began privately advocating for an alliance with the Bolsheviks. Many in the left SRs believed, correctly, that the Bolsheviks were gearing up for a revolution, and believed that a broad, homogeneous socialist coalition would be the best way for this revolution to be successful. They also wanted to serve as a check on the power of the Bolsheviks, as they ironically opposed revolutionary terror and violence and wanted the revolution to be as bloodless as possible. As such, members of the left SRs began secret negotiations with the Bolsheviks as early as October. This proved an unexpected boon, as many in the Bolshevik party did not believe that they were capable of pulling things off on their own, and Zinoviev and Kamenev made an alliance with the left SRs a condition of their support for the planned revolution. And, of course, the All-Russian Executive Committee of the Railwaymen's Union, aka Vishkel, which was the single most powerful union in the country, threatened to suspend all rail traffic in the country in the aftermath of the revolution if the Bolsheviks didn't concede to a coalition government. As such, in the early weeks of October 1917, the left SRs were added to the Military Revolutionary Committee in Petrograd. Finally, on October 25th, November 7th of 1917, the Bolsheviks rose up, stormed the Winter Palace, and dispersed the provisional government. On the same day, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was held, with the Bolsheviks attempting to legitimize their uprising before the Petrograd Soviet. And in their corner stood the left SRs, much to the shock of the rightists. They put her in a small, windowless cinder-block cell with only a small trapdoor. The chairman had heard of the pigeon and wanted no such witchery this time. As she wept alone in the darkness and silence of her cell again, she realized the walls were getting closer. She pounded her fists against the brick until her hands bled, threw herself against the trapdoor until her knees were purple with bruises, and wailed until her watery lungs could no longer produce a sound. Just as the walls began to press against her, the trapdoor gave, and down, down, down she went, where she found her fellow fire breathers. This Congress served as the formal split of the Socialist Revolutionaries. The left SR delegates, including Spiridonova, voted in favor of the seizure of power by the Soviets, giving the Bolsheviks a majority at the Congress and effectively voting the party of Lenin into power. After the SR leadership demanded they leave Milrevkom and submit to party discipline, they refused, and the left faction was formally expelled from PSR the following day. As such, the Party of Left Socialist Revolutionaries was established. Despite their ostensive support, their relationship with the Bolsheviks was very far from perfect, and negotiations for a coalition were, shall we say, rife with conflict. PLSR disagreed with the Bolsheviks on a few fundamental issues, the most notable of which was their complete opposition to single-party dictatorship and their opposition to the usage of revolutionary terror. It seemed for a moment that no coalition at all would come about, but in the following weeks the revolution was shown to be way less stable than anticipated, with sporadic fighting breaking out in cities across Russia as people opposed the rise of Soviet power. Coupled with Vyshkel throwing their weight around and the peasant congresses threatening to rout the Soviets completely in the countryside, PLSR was able to twist Lenin's arm just enough that they conceded to a few things. Now, as we know, allying with the Bolsheviks has literally never worked out for anyone in any of these videos, not even the Bolsheviks themselves, so this decision seems naive at best and downright suicidal at worst. But PLSR were nothing if not optimistic, and they firmly believed that they had to try and moderate the Bolsheviks and demand that they stick to the principles of democracy and liberty that they claimed to be fighting for. Their hearts were in the right place, but alas, history would show them to be tragic fools. The Bolsheviks promised some concessions, which included adding a bunch of peasant deputies to the Central Executive Committee and agreed to a very shaky coalition with the left SRs. As a part of this, they were given several posts in Sovnarkom as well as several military appointments. The most important thing this did for the Bolsheviks was give them a force that could reach the peasantry, and basically the only reason why peasant revolts didn't topple the fledgling Bolshevik government was the left SRs utilizing their influence to calm the situation down. PLSR would dominate basically all peasant-related organs of the new government, including the offices responsible for socializing land, a policy which Lenin had decided to implement to try and win over the peasants. And PLSR championed this as a major victory of Narodnik policy nearly 60 years in the making. Their other major victory was gaining sizable influence over the Cheka, and using that influence to actually veto the executions of political opponents, which made the first few months of Bolshevik rule far kinder and freer than they would be in the future. As for Spiridonova, she wasn't given a cabinet position, but she was appointed the head of the peasant section of the Central Executive Committee, which gave her a lot of power in the government as she could singularly command the near total respect and loyalty of the peasantry of Russia. During the first meeting of the reshuffled Central Executive Committee, she gave a speech to said peasant deputies, and I want to read you this quote because I think it sums up her character perfectly. "We shall attain our ideals not just through hatred, but also through feelings of pity for all who suffer and love, for all who are oppressed. For our ideals we shall give everything, our lives and even perhaps our honor. We must cast off the last traces of slavery in our psychological outlook. We must eliminate hatred among ourselves and direct our enmity solely against our enemies. We must develop mutual respect and tolerance towards our comrades in the struggle that awaits us. We must become better, purer, more sincere, so that no one should dare say that our insurrection is bringing forth hatred and evil. Upon the ruins of the old society there is being born, hidden from our eyes, a new society of justice and love." Isn't she just so wholesome? She is far too kind a soul. Russia did not deserve someone like her. Anyways, Constituent Assembly elections happened at the end of November 1917 and placed the SRs in a commanding lead over the Bolsheviks. But it is helpful to know that PLSR and the right SRs were not legally split on paper, so how much of this vote went to either faction is not really distinguished. Spiridonova herself was actually elected to a constituency seat for the Vladimir district, although as will soon be seen, this election was functionally ceremonial. The coalition arrangement continued to be relatively stable into the new year 1918, leading up to the first and only convocation of the Constituent Assembly on January 18th. The Bolsheviks and left SRs jointly declared that their presidential candidate would be Spiridonova, but the position went to Viktor Chernov instead. He held this post for all of 5 minutes before the Bolsheviks dissolved the assembly, putting an end to the democratic aspirations of Russia permanently. PLSR was split on this, but they tacitly went along with it to not rock the boat. Bolshevik and left SR policy became very blurred afterwards, with party leaders and newspapers critiquing the Bolsheviks less and less, and beginning to gradually support certain methods of revolutionary terror. It seemed like the two had intertwined to the point that an effective merger had occurred, but there was exactly one point that the left SRs utterly refused to compromise on: their internationalism. PLSR sincerely believed in the ideals of world revolution, and they very much believed that World War I Revolution was the event that would trigger it, at least in the West. So when the Bolshevik delegation to Brest-Litovsk not only failed to achieve peace without annexations, but actually ceded a massive amount of territory and dropped out of the war, leaving their socialist comrades in the West to their own devices, they got angry. The deeply internationalist PLSR could not abide by the results of the treaty. The Bolsheviks had betrayed the Russian people by capitulating to German imperialism. In protest, they withdrew their representatives from Sovnarkom and took several political measures that hindered the governing abilities of the Bolsheviks. As such, the April 1918 Congress of the Left SRs was a bit tense. Spiridonova, for her part, actually opposed the withdrawing from Sovnarkom because she had adopted a very realist stance when it came to Bolshevik cooperation. She believed that the Bolsheviks were inherently incapable of fulfilling the ideals of the revolution without them, and in the name of revolutionary solidarity, they would need to keep them propped up or risk the entire experiment collapsing. She did not get her way, and a massive gulf opened between the two parties that would never be bridged again. Spiridonova's opinions here would change very, very quickly. The Bolsheviks screwed up repeatedly over the spring, and the treaty was just the first in a series. The loss of so much agricultural and industrial output meant that the cities were now teetering on the brink of famine, and the Bolsheviks introduced a forced grain requisitioning policy causing mass chaos in the countryside as the peasants got agitated once again. Spiridonova, as head of the Peasant Bureau, was at the front lines of a surge of angry peasants, all demanding for this policy to be reversed. The Bolsheviks also took a sledgehammer to democracy by disbanding every elected Soviet where they did not have a majority, angering people further. Ironically, the Mensheviks and Right SRs, still in the Central Committee, supported the Left SR resistance against these policies, for which they were both fully expelled from government. Her belief that the Bolsheviks were going to botch this, suddenly proven correct, her tone shifted dramatically. The anger of the peasants translated into support for PLSR, and this combined with anger over the surrender to Germany and the encroaching starvation of the cities to create a legitimate crisis for the Bolsheviks. In the run-up to the 5th Congress of Soviets in early July, there was suddenly a chance that they could lose control of their own government. PLSR had nearly doubled in membership in 3 short months, and popular anger over the treaty was brewing. The final straw for the Left SRs was the arrival of one Count Mirbach to Moscow, formalizing relations between the Bolsheviks and the Germans, which many saw as a complete betrayal of the revolution. By the arrival of the Third Party Congress on June 28th, Spiridonova had changed her tune, as did much of the party. As Operation Michael in the West bled itself to death, many were now convinced Germany was going to lose this war, and that speeding up its defeat would bring about their prophesied mass revolution in the West. The Bolsheviks had aligned themselves with the dying imperialist regime in a desperate attempt to save face. In reality, the Germans could never have hoped to subjugate Russia, and any attempt to do so would simply stoke the revolutionary fires of the righteous masses. She believed that, since the peasantry were already violently resisting German occupation in Ukraine, the logic follows that the Russian peasantry would resist with just as much force. If Germany could be baited into launching further expeditions east, then the masses would be stirred to popular revolt in the name of the socialist dream. She still believed that the Bolsheviks could be redeemed, but those that betrayed the revolution at Brest-Litovsk needed to be shown the light, so to speak. This continued her deeply optimistic and often naive streak, and many delegates disagreed with her. While PLSR was at the zenith of its power and popularity, they couldn't count on the workers to take up arms. They were exhausted, demoralized, and sympathetic to the Bolsheviks. However, the overwhelming majority of the party delegates supported at least some sort of action directed against the agents of German imperialism, confident due to their newfound influence. And what else did they suggest but a return to form, advocated for by Spiridonova herself. The 5th Congress of Soviets at the beginning of July opened to the complete collapse of the coalition. Kamkov took to the stage and publicly denounced the policy of conceding to the Germans, triggering a long verbal exchange between the two factions. PLSR failed to gain a majority, and with the Mensheviks and Right SRs being expelled, they now stood alone. As such, they sought to level the playing field, so to speak. PLSR had managed to worm its way into the Cheka apparatus, a fact that would be used to their advantage. On the afternoon of July 6th of 1918, 2 Cheka agents talked their way into the German embassy in Moscow using a letter allegedly signed by Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the head of the Cheka. Count Mirbach agreed to meet with the 2 men, and after some brief pleasantries, Mirbach was shot multiple times and died at the scene. After Dzerzhinsky made his way to the building where the Central Committee of the Left SRs was meeting, he was promptly arrested because the SRs had half the Moscow Cheka with them. Thus began the very brief revolt of the Left SRs. Spiridonova assumed the political responsibility for the assassination on behalf of the Central Committee, and she went over to the building of the Congress of Soviets and announced the hit to everyone and gave a fiery speech denouncing the German control over the Bolshevik government, requesting that they join the SRs and removing them from the country. Moscow promptly fell into complete chaos. The Soviet took the left SR delegates hostage, Spiridonova included, and locked the doors. She had a very funny encounter with Trotsky where she decried her arrest, to which Trotsky replied in a sardonic tone that she was a part of a plot to overthrow the government, which, in Spiridonova's eyes, was not even the intention. Lenin had dispatched most of the Moscow garrison to go crush a peasant revolt, so all that was in Moscow were a couple of companies of the Latvian riflemen, meaning that the Cheka units loyal to the left SRs seized control of Lubyanka as well as several barracks and the post office. Lenin initially had a panic attack, thinking the entire Cheka had revolted against him, and made a desperate bargain with Vazietas to crash every gun he could into the city. However, despite the left SRs holding all of the cards, they seemed to hesitate at the critical moment. They sent out several impassioned pleas to the masses of Russia, not asking them to revolt against the Bolsheviks, but asking them to rise up against the Germans and tear down the treaty. But after they did this, they simply did nothing. The Bolsheviks, ever the pragmatists, did not immediately cave to these revolutionary demands, and the general populace of Russia was either apathetic or simply did not hear the call before communications were cut off. Through the 6th and 7th, there were some brief skirmishes in Moscow and Petrograd before the Latvian riflemen were able to mobilize and slowly grind the Cheka out of their fortified buildings. Over a dozen Chekists were executed in the days following, and those SR leaders that weren't captured fled the city into hiding. Thus ended the very brief revolt of the left SRs. Noble as their cause was, even the most sympathetic will have to admit that their little revolt was a case of delusional adventurism. The popular support that they would have needed to pull off such a revolt simply did not exist, and they underestimated how ruthless and uncompromising the Bolsheviks had become. The left SRs were so possessed by their internationalist aspirations that they missed the forest for the trees, and didn't realize that the workers and peasants did not care about the treaty with the Germans when they were struggling to put food on the table. The only thing their revolt accomplished was giving Lenin an excuse to crush their party and secure their single-party dictatorship for good, functionally ending the very socialist democracy the SRs fought so hard for. Their reforms, such as their pride and joy land socialization, were also rolled back and replaced with hardline Marxist nationalization and the policy of war communism. In 48 hours, the left SRs unintentionally committed a very elaborate mass suicide, and they would cease to be relevant going forward. Which brings us back to Spiridonova, who was now stripped of her freedom once again, and this time there would be no revolution to save her. "Quickly," they said. "Dress in this blouse and tie this scarf over your fine black hair. Put this coat over and run home as fast as you can." She did so, but this was not the end. Just as she slipped into her quilt-covered bed, she was dragged from her home and found herself kneeling at the heavy boots of the chairman's guards once again, alongside her fellow fire-breathers. Despite pleading and promising to never breathe fire again, the brutes threw her on a train and slammed the door behind her. This time she was going south, where, instead of snow, sand covered the earth. There she stayed, in the dust, for 7 more years. The Bolsheviks undertook a ruthless persecution of the left SRs, arresting thousands of party members and executing hundreds more. Both of their newspapers were banned, and they were expelled from the Soviets and purged from the Cheka, which promptly embraced the mass revolutionary terror that the left SRs had been desperately preventing. What remained of PLSR split, with several factions defecting to the Bolsheviks. Their final party congress was held in October, after which the party as a whole mostly faded into irrelevancy, although there were splinter groups that retained its character. Spiridonova was held in the Kremlin for several months, where she awaited her death without fear. She was a romantic idealist to the last, and revolutionary martyrdom continued to be a tantalizing prospect. She also was initially scheduled for public trial, where she planned to make yet another grand spectacle and stoke the fires once more with her words. Anticipating this, the Bolsheviks held the trial in secret on November 27th of 1918, where she was sentenced to a year in prison, for which she would be amnestied the next day. Why they were so lenient to one of PLSR's most well-known figures is unknown. She immediately returned to political activities, attempting to resurrect what was left of the party, taking command of one of its splinter factions that became radically anti-Bolshevik. Her popularity and recognition had never waned. Many saw her life of revolt and suffering as symbolic of that of the entire working and peasant class, and a veritable cult of personality had developed around her likeness as the Scarlet Valkyrie who would liberate the downtrodden of Russia from both Bolshevik and white tyranny. She decried the Bolsheviks as revolutionary traitors in bed with capital, but distanced herself from the more radical loyal PLSR remnants that reverted to their terrorist ways. She would give dozens of speeches, riling up the peasants and causing problems for Bolshevik governance. And on January 22nd of 1919, she would be rearrested by the Cheka for her increasingly inflammatory remarks. The nightmare of Maria Spiridonova was only just beginning. On February 24th, she was put on trial, again in secret. The only witness for the prosecution was Nikolai Bukharin, a man she had never even personally met. He decreed that Spiridonova was a mentally ill lunatic, echoing the old cadet presses and many of her former Right SR allies. There is another point to be made here about the weaponization of mental illness and it being used as a flimsy justification for eliminating political rivals, but again, that's beyond the scope of this particular video. Once again, her status as a woman was used against her. They saw her to be improper and non-conforming, so they declared her a hysteric and shoved her in a sanatorium. Now, this was not a real sanatorium, it was essentially an unused room of the Kremlin Guards barracks, and her health issues reappeared. Badly. She was struck by bouts of illness once again and fell into a deep depression. She was able to charm a guard, however, and with the help of some left SR allies, managed to escape in April. Her last year of freedom was spent in hiding under an assumed name, and her health did not recover. She spent her time in between clandestine party meetings doing a lot of writing and being bedridden with repeated outbreaks of typhus and several nervous breakdowns and depressive spirals. She was quickly becoming the person her enemies had spent years labeling her as. She would eventually be recaptured in October of 1920, with Cheka units kicking the door down while she was incapacitated and couldn't flee. She was held for just over a year in a psychiatric prison before being released and placed in the care of a couple of left SRs who had been pardoned by the regime. One of them was Alexandra Izmailovich, her best friend, who had also been in and out of prison since the uprising. She was an exceptionally strong woman herself and did her best to care for her friend whenever she could. The group was sent to the Moscow suburb of Malakhovka until 1923, where they were rearrested and sentenced to administrative exile for the made-up crime of conspiring to flee the country. Spiridonova and Izmailovich were exiled to Kaluga until 1925, after which they were sent to Samarkand where they linked up with Kakhovskaya. The trio worked rather boring secretarial and labor jobs to keep their heads above water, with Spiridonova taking a leading role in the land reform efforts in the region. In 1928, the trio were exiled again to Tashkent, never being allowed to settle in one place for too long. For a few months in 1930, Spiridonova was sent to a sanatorium in Yalta in Crimea because her health had gotten so bad she was teetering on the brink of death due to a severe bout of typhoid fever, for which she was forced to pay out of pocket using generous donations from some of her friends and allies who had managed to escape the country. After she recovered to an acceptable degree, she was rearrested and sent to Ufa along with her two friends. In Ufa, she would share an apartment with Izmailovich and Kakhovskaya, as well as a fella named Ilya Mayarov, another former left SR leader. Sometime in the late 1920s, he and Spiridonova would actually marry, although it mattered little in the grand scheme of things. Also present was Mayarov's elderly father, his son from his prior marriage, and Kakhovskaya's equally old aunt. She stayed in Ufa for a while, working as an economic planner at an agricultural bank, which allowed her some satisfaction knowing she was helping build socialism in a small way. By this point, the three women had sworn off politics completely and had no interest in resisting the Soviet state. They had no ability to. They had very few friends and were watched constantly by the secret police, and by this point their only desire was to just be left alone. Izmailovich even published a little book about art, but even this small piece would be denied to them. By 1937, Stalin's Great Purges had begun carving their way through Soviet society, the Ufa group largely oblivious to their nature due to their isolation. When they did hear reports, they disregarded the danger as a simple conflict between the Bolsheviks. As such, when on February 8th of 1937, the NKVD knocked down their door and arrested everyone in the household, they were caught off guard. Nikolai Eshov had conjured up a mythical SR terrorist cell and accused the group of plotting to overthrow the government of the Bashkir ASSR. After the government of said Bashkir ASSR was also arrested, the charges were changed to a plot to assassinate Big J Stalin and Klement Voroshilov, equally fanciful and fabricated charges. For 7 long months, Spiridonova was subjected to horrific torture once more. This time there was no fancifying or creative wordplay. This time she was just brutalized. She was beaten, groped, strip-searched several times a day, and interrogated for hours every day for multiple weeks by an especially vulgar and aggressive officer named Mikhailov. She was denied anything more than limited sleep for weeks at a time, was escorted at every moment of her existence, and was eventually transferred between half a dozen prisons as the investigation into her alleged plots intentionally dragged on for months. But, once again, at no point did she break. Mariia no longer held any fear of death. The usual methods of extracting confessions simply didn't work on her, which only led to further torture, but at no point did she break. In November of 1937, convinced that she was about to die, she wrote an extensive letter and last testament to the NKVD leadership, where she discussed in detail her treatment at the hands of these brutes, as well as decrying this inhumanity and the absolute travesty of justice that was unfolding. She essentially requested that they stop beating around the bush and just kill her if that was their plan. They had known her every move since 1921, and it was functionally impossible for her to have participated in any such conspiracy. And, of course, she criticized the NKVD's made-up stories due to how simply ignorant of the actual methods of terrorism they were. Professionals have standards, after all. She did not confess, nor did Kakhovskaya or Izmailovich, but Mayarov did. After the life of his son was threatened, he confessed to a series of crimes that the group did not commit, in a desperate bid to save his life. This was combined with further forcefully extracted testimony from other SR members who were broken down through torture to paint her as the center of a massive countrywide conspiracy with numerous opposition parties in league with every foreign country under the sun. They all thought confessing would save them, but all it did was prolong the inevitable. Every one of them, along with their families, would die regardless, but Spiridonova never did. She was a woman of strong conviction, and not even death, torture, or betrayal by almost everyone she knew and loved could shatter it. She was the tragic hero, fit to be the protagonist of any number of Russian literary works, and there would be no greater honor than to die for her beliefs. To quote, "This was made specifically clear to me with great simplicity on the second day of my arrest by the former plenipotentiary of Bashakiria. We have to crush Spiridonova morally, to put her on her knees and force her to ask, to beg for forgiveness, to crawl, yes, grovel at our feet, so we can be finished with her once and for all. And I answer, you can kill me, you have the power and the laws to do so, but I shall die standing." Her trial lasted little more than half an hour. And so, fire breathers, we are here. The last trial, on the train back to the forests and fields from which she came. From which I came. Fire has not passed my lips in 15 years, though I try to let it flow from my pen where I can. There isn't much left. My embers are nearly out, and I can feel my lungs filling with water. I tire of trains and brick and bars, of men's hands and women's cries, and the cold wind that blows them all away. I wish only to watch the leaves fall from the trees, and hold the rich black earth in my hands. I haven't eaten in days, because I know I will be feeding the soil soon. I only hope it goes quickly, and that the oaks find me nourishing. It was becoming increasingly clear that Stalin had no intention of letting her go. Her sentencing was handed down as 25 years of imprisonment, as well as the seizure of all her belongings and the loss of all political rights. She was initially held in Yaroslavl before being moved to Vladimir and then to Ariel. She was held in isolation, forbidden from interacting with anyone other than her guards. Much like her prior imprisonments, her health was consistently poor, but this time there was no sympathetic doctor to help her, nor did it look like any revolution was coming to save her. She was alone. Her fire and passion had been mercilessly snuffed out, leaving her naught but smoldering embers. In Ariel, she stayed for 3 long years. Eventually, however, circumstances far beyond her control compelled the state that had taken more from her than the vile czarist could have ever dreamed into dramatic action to crush what was left of Maria Alexandrovna. As German tanks rolled towards Ariel in the fall of 1941, it was determined that the 170 political prisoners in the city were to be dealt with. False charges of spreading defeatist propaganda and plotting to escape and engage in subversive activities were conjured up as a flimsy justification. Lavrenti Beria sent the list of those deemed to be dangerous agitators to Stalin, who approved it without question. On September 8th of 1941, 161 would be sentenced to death, and of those sentenced, 157 were to be shot. No case was ever opened, no proceedings were held, and the prisoners were not informed that this trial was even being undertaken. Amongst those to be executed included the surviving members of the 2nd and 3rd Moscow trials, which included Christian Rakovsky and Sergei Besanov, Leon Trotsky's sister Olga Kameneva, Alexandra Izmailovich, a large number of European and Chinese nationals, most of the surviving former socialist revolutionary leaders, Nikolai Yeshov's brother Sergei, and Spiridonova's husband Mayarov, who was not informed that she was at the same prison and spent his last hours pleading to be allowed to see her. Spiridonova herself was also on the list. Utmost secrecy was maintained, and most of those to be executed were thoroughly unpersoned and effectively stripped from the public record. Spiridonova was one of the last. She was pulled from her cell cell and taken to a special room on the morning of September 11th, 1941, where she was gagged to prevent the possibility of screaming or raising any word in her own defense. She was quiet as her sentencing was read out. The sentenced were driven out to the nearby Medvedev forest. Hours prior, trees in an unmarked section of the woods were uprooted and moved, with large burial trenches dug in their place. The prisoners were led to their final resting place, lined up along the trenches, and shot, one by one. Taking in the gentle rustling of the leaves and the warmth of the sun on her skin one final time, she closed her eyes. She could find a degree of peace with herself that the tyrant could never take from her. She died with her integrity, her honor, and her beliefs intact. She did not know how history would remember her, nor if it would remember her at all. But let it simply be known that Maria Alexandrovna Spiridonova died unbroken, and at least the oaks would find her nourishing. The mass graves were covered with dirt, and the trees were replanted over them. To this day, the body of Maria Spiridonova has never been found. On October 3rd, the Germans occupied Oriol, totally unaware of the massacre that had taken place, as the NKVD had gone through strenuous effort to cover its tracks. Knowledge of the slaughter in the Medvedev woods only became public knowledge after 1953, as it was one of the events used to justify Beria's own execution. Irina Kakhovskaya was the only major SR figure in Russia to survive the Great Purge, and she petitioned for Spiridonova's rehabilitation in 1958 during de-Stalinization, but this was rejected. It wouldn't be until 1990 when charges laid against her in 1938 and 41 were posthumously dropped, and a memorial was constructed in the Medvedev forest to bring some peace to the victims after all of that time. In 1992, Spiridonova would be fully rehabilitated and her 1918 charges were also dropped. Tragically little remains of her in the popular consciousness, and scholarship around her is fairly limited compared to many of the other victims of Stalinist terror. It wasn't until after the fall of the Soviet Union that historiography began to portray her as anything other than the generally accepted view of her as a radical hysteric who didn't understand what she was doing. She ultimately completed her role as the tragic hero, a woman who gave everything for her revolutionary ideals, who stood up for herself and for the people of Russia without fear or compromise, but was destined to never see the sun rise on a land free of tyrants. Massive thank you and shout out to Ainsley Louise Suntians for writing the creative chapter openers. It's a little experimental, but I think they turned out very good, and I hope you all enjoyed them. I have linked her Instagram at her request in the description. I will also shout out my supporters over on Patreon. You are all incredible and help the channel thrive. Extra special thanks goes to Ukrainian Shadow Government, Charles Jalak, Peter Bardos, Ministry of Autismus Affairs, Wolf Commissar, Jonathan Hernandez, Cheese122, A Normal Cow 5, Black Mare, Andrew Deffenbach, Jay, Ray Nertz, Ouch That Hurt, Seor, Harper's Ferry Blues, Ziam Z, Greek Nationalist, The Flag and Anthem Guy, Price, The Oil Master, Gangdolf Bangdolf, Arabian Nights, Kim, Ask89, Codename Titan Zebra, L. Walter Darrow, Protector of the Faith and General Secretary of the National Salvation Council, iRatman, Billiam Bones, CT Oldsmobile, Comrade Cosmo, Clever Riley 9, WLF 251, Jimmy Legs, A Dog with Sunglasses, Snow Cone Squad, Newt Schmidt, and Anthony. If you too would like to help out the channel, consider joining my Patreon. Tiers 2 and 3 get access to the Spartan Journal, extra content every month. I also have a special video planned for all tiers of patrons for December, so don't miss out. And on that note, that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.